Welcome to the podcast Byzantium and Friends. I am Anthony, your host. In the first 2 centuries of its existence, the city of Constantinople witnessed phenomenal growth. It was built on the site of the ancient city of Byzantium, whose population may have been around 25,000. And within 2 centuries, before the Justinianic plague in 541, the population of Constantinople was about 500,000. Now, the demographic aspects of that expansion have not been studied much, but we know a lot about the monuments that were built, from the palace and the hippodrome to the boulevards and the colonnades and statue collections and the churches and so forth, the imperial fora with the columns, the walls. We have building regulations that talk about multi-story apartment buildings. There's a law by the Emperor Zeno in the later 5th century, which was written in Greek because he acknowledged that the population of the city understood that language more than Latin, in which imperial law was usually issued. And the law codifies such rights as a view to the sea. You were not allowed to block your neighbor's view of it. By the way, I'm back on the Corinthian Gulf again. I'm actually looking at the sea right now, and you can probably hear the cicadas in the background. That's not a microphone buzz. So anyway, after the mid-6th century, the city enters this demographic decline. There was a plague, there were food shortages, the inability of the imperial government to sustain such a massive urban population. In the early 7th century, when the Persians and then the Arabs conquered Egypt, which was the main source of the grain, the people just literally had to leave because the emperors could not provide enough grain for such a large population. And it's estimated that by the end of the 7th century, say around 700, the population of Constantinople may have fell to about 100,000 and possibly even less. Some scholars estimate 40,000. And it's worth thinking about that moment. It means that 1 out of every 5 dwellings, houses or manors or palaces or apartment buildings or neighborhoods, 1 out of every 5 was occupied. The rest were either abandoned or in ruins. That's logically what that means. Right? This was a city of ghosts. Right? The majority of the built environment was abandoned or in ruins. It would have been the perfect moment to study the city. Like if you could be like an architectural historian or an archaeologist and you picked a moment where you could study, an ancient imperial capital with the least amount of intervention in people's lives, even without having to excavate, because most of it would have been, lying around on the ground. That would be the moment, right? Fewest number of people, the maximum number of surviving buildings that are just there available for you to study. The situation today is obviously exactly the opposite. Istanbul today has over 15 million inhabitants. The city has expanded well outside the boundaries of the Byzantine capital, outside the walls, and the surviving monuments of Byzantine Constantinople they're few, they're not in very good shape, they're sometimes hard to find, they're sometimes lying underneath subsequent buildings or built into them, or are in their basements, or whatever. Now, a long history of urban overhaul and rebuilding and destructions and fires and wars and sieges and so forth fills up the period between 700 and today, obviously, and changes of regime and changes of the dominant religion and dominant dynasties and so forth. This makes it all the more difficult and all the more important to have reliable and accessible user-friendly guides to what survives of Byzantine Constantinople. And the odd thing is that we haven't had such a thing, at least not in English, in a very long time. There is a technical, archaeological literature, and there are also some kind of quasi-encyclopedias of the city's Byzantine monuments in German and in French and Spanish, but we actually haven't had one in English. So I was thrilled when the book that we will be discussing today was published, and I thought it would be a great idea to have a two-part series with a guest who could speak on the politics of the material past. So this was our previous episode with Jonathan Hall, and to complement it with a book that looks at the material remains of Byzantine Constantinople in Istanbul today. So picking out the Byzantine remains from the many, many layers of history that the city has. My guest today is Sergey Ivanov, who is Alexander von Humboldt Fellow at the University of Munich and a corresponding member of the British Academy. He has written many studies about Byzantine culture and Byzantine history, and I'll pick out two topics on which he's written sort of the fundamental reference monographs, which is the history of holy fools, so the tradition of saints who are called holy fools in Byzantium and early Rus and Russia, and also the history and cultural politics of Byzantine missions, that is the degree to which Byzantine authorities, state and church, were interested in converting foreign people. But the book that we will be discussing today is called In Search of Constantinople, a guidebook through Byzantine Istanbul and its surroundings, which has been translated by the Russian and published in Istanbul by the Swedish Research Institute there. So if you're traveling to Istanbul in the near future and you want to pick up a book that will take you through the physical history of the monuments and also the events and textual sources that pertain to them, arranged according to routes that you can take in order to see them in the most efficient way, this is the book. Again, many thanks to medievalists.net for reposting these episodes, and straight now to my conversation with Sergey. Sergey, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
So I read your very interesting book. It took me back to some summers that I had spent in Istanbul. And so let me start with a personal question, which is sort of important when, explaining why we decide to write the books that we do. So do you have a personal, emotional connection to the city? And what sorts of things do you most associate with it in your sort of personal experience?
Well, I came to Istanbul for the first time in 1993, and I was right away captivated by the notion of, Atlantis, a Byzantine Atlantis, drowned and somehow shimmering faintly through the mist of time.
Yes.
By then, in the mid-90s, I was writing my first monograph on holy fools. So, of course, the life of Andrew the Fool was of extreme importance for me. And when I came to Chamberlain Tash, to the, column of Constantine the Great, I immediately recollected the prophecy which Andrew the Fool gave in the 10th century, that Constantinople will be flooded by the sea, he said, and only the column on the forum will survive for ships to tie ropes to, and sailors will weep, saying that woe are we, for our great city has been swallowed by the abyss. So, and this was my impression, that the column is indeed rises majestically, towering over the sea of alien life, swirling around its base. And this impression has always a grip over me when I'm in Constantinople, that I'm looking at the mountains which are sticking up from the sea of oblivion. This is why it was so impressive for me. So the idea for this guide was born out of my feeling that I call in myself historical sentimentalism. I'm deeply stirred by the thought of some well, past event occurring on particularly this spot when I'm now standing, as if the echoes of ancient voices still reverberated in the air around. And therefore, a few, well, unassuming bricks overgrown with weed can still call forth a wave of strong emotions, sometimes much more strong than when it's a proper monument with properly captioned. So
Okay.
yeah, I think this is where this book comes from.
So I did not know this about you. So you are a poet at heart. Yeah, because your writings are very analytical and documented and so forth. But okay, so there's a different person here.
Yeah, there is a fire under the surface. Yes.
That's good. That's good. Hold on to that. So why did you feel that this guidebook had to be written? How does it differ from other, books taking visitors through the monuments of Istanbul? How does it differ?
We have lots of guidebooks, say Rome of the Caesars. Yeah, it's pretty normal to come across such a guidebook in a way while you're in Italy. Or Jerusalem of Jesus. It's also, not uncommon. Or London of Shakespeare. Yeah, it's pretty normal genre of tourist. Well, not of course mainstream, but pretty widely known kind of literature. And no such books about Constantinople exist. There are more or less two guidebooks more or less comparable to mine. One written by a Byzantinist, Jan Kostinets from Czech Republic, which is entitled Walking Through Byzantium Great Palace Region, published in 2007. And it's famous for its, computer reconstructions of monuments of Constantinople. And the other Spanish one by some Aguada Velázquez, also published in 2007 in Spanish, but he's he's an enthusiastic amateur. He's a photographer, so that's why it's a little bit amateurish. Otherwise, there are no guys like this, and I think it's worthwhile having it if you go to Istanbul interested in its past.
Yes, actually, I have the Spanish book. I saw it in a bookshop in Madrid and picked it up, which I regretted because it's very heavy. So I had to put it down.
But it's beautifully illustrated, and
yes,
that's why it's so heavy. Yeah.
Yes, I think I had to carry it with me as a carry-on, as a separate carry-on, because putting it in the suitcase put me over the limit. Anyway, yes, no, it has wonderful maps and illustrations and so on. But you're right, there isn't a targeted guidebook for, here's, if you're interested in Byzantine Constantinople, here's what you focus on and follow this route and look for these things. So you're exactly right. And thank you for doing this. I would have really used this a few years ago when I was doing some study abroad groups in Istanbul. So let's look at the sort of Byzantine antecedents for your project. Are there Byzantine guidebooks to the city?
Well, the tradition of recounting tales connected to historical monuments when visiting those monuments is one that goes back to antiquity. It was Lucian who satirizes such guides. So this practice had transformed itself into its own literary genre in Constantinople as well. In mid-Byzantine times, judging from the recurrence of certain stories and anecdotes found first in Greek sources and then repeated in the accounts of medieval texts written in Latin, Arabic, Slavic, Armenian. Tour guides in Constantinople never lacked for work, and it's very understandable because pilgrims who were flooding Constantinople, they did not walk around this megapolis alone. According to the great metaphor used by Stephen of Novgorod, Rus pilgrim, Entering Constantinople is like entering a great forest. It's impossible to get around without a good guide. Indeed, they were accompanied by tour guides, and these pilgrims were huge numbers of them. We have dozens of reports by pilgrims, and recently I even made an article reconstructing the tourist guide's narrative behind the report by Anthony of Novgorod of the year 1200. I delivered a lecture at Koch University in November about this. And I must say that, in reconstructing the figure of the guide behind Anthony's back, I rely on my personal experience, because for many years I was teaching a university seminar at Constantinople. So not less than 6 times I took groups of my students there, and I had great empathy with Anthony's guide, playing the role of guide myself. Of course, the guide had to infuse awe before sanctuaries, but also he has to entertain pilgrims. He retells anecdotes. Yeah, he has to engage listeners by putting questions and asking them to guess the right answer. They must hear captivating stories, and there must be some human touches, some impressive figures, and so on. So yeah, of course this literature, but it was not, of course, it was not perceived as a high literary genre, but as a practical guide for tourist guides. I'm sure it existed.
Sure. And even there are Greek texts that collect some of these legends about different sites, and you use them very well and strategically in your guidebook. And you keep a distinction, you make a distinction always between, the more historical sources, but the legends also associated with the monuments. And I've sometimes thought about these tour guides, and there was a time when I suspected that the text that's called the narrative for the building of Hagia Sophia was constructed largely for that purpose, so that people who were giving tours in Constantinople could tell stories about different parts of the monument as they went around it.
Mm-hmm.
But and I suspected also that they might have been the eunuchs associated with the Hagia Sophia church, on the staff. But anyway, I'm just making that up. So who do you intend as the readers or users of your book? Or put differently, how is it organized?
It's a highly specialized guidebook, but nonetheless, it's exactly that, a guidebook. And it provides specific routes to specific historical sites. The book is accompanied by numerous maps and architectural plans. And I described everything known and noteworthy about them. But this guidebook, of course, is devoted exclusively to Byzantine Constantinople. So it has nothing to do with the Ottoman monuments, some of which are also very old. And it tells nothing about even modern Greek churches, if there are no proofs that they have some Byzantine pedigree. And it can be used as a proper guidebook, but I think it can also be used as a just reading book for anybody interested or curious about Byzantine Constantinople, even just sitting at home. At least I tried to make it a good reading.
Yes, I read it through that way, and I actually made a lot of notes in the beginning. Things I'm going to use not for walking through Istanbul, just they were very interesting, and even some images that. When you were talking about the Hora and you had a number of images from inside, I was struck by the one that is the registration of the Holy Family, when they're in front of the official, and you talk about that a little bit. That's such a wonderful image for like encapsulating so much about Byzantium. Like,
Absolutely,
yeah,
absolutely.
yeah.
It's my beloved picture. Yeah, I like it so much.
Yeah, it's you got the bureaucracy and the Holy Family and the political authority, and they're all in this one frame. And anyway,
Mhm. And
um,
did you notice that the governor sitting is of the same size as the
hmm,
Theotokos standing?
yeah,
So, in a sort, governor is much more important figure on this mosaic.
yes, yes. And you talk about the gestures that they're
Mhm.
making from left to right, and anyway, it's great stuff. So, and I mentioned the Hora. So, if our listeners, if they haven't visited Istanbul and they're thinking about the Byzantine monuments, they likely know at least two of them, which is Hagia Sophia and Hora. And so let's entice them to see more and sort of get them both into the guidebook and the city. So apart from those two famous monuments, what three others would you recommend to visitors as sort of must-see places, and why?
Well, of course, it's hard to choose because there are around 100 Byzantine monuments. Not many, of course, for such a huge city.
Yeah.
But anyway, so out of dozens places of note, I would single out first Sergius and Vakos Church.
Hmm.
It can be easily reached. It's just near the Hippodrome and the very heart of the historical peninsula. I like this small church very much. It's now called Küçük Hagia Sophia, which means small Hagia Sophia, but in fact, it does not look like it. It's quite a different architecture. And I would say very, very avant-garde architecture by 6th century standards. You can, while inside, you can see the transition from the first to the second floor as a transition from the architecture of antiquity to that of early Byzantium. But because while below the architraves, friezes, and cornices directly atop of the columns call to mind the ancient world, but above, each pair of columns is topped by an arch, like in Hagia Sophia. And in general, altogether, the building leaves the impression of flawless harmony and absolute undescribable perfection. So I highly recommend anybody who comes to Istanbul to visit this wonderful church, which now, although it serves as a mosque, so you have to adjust to the time of namaz. But in this particular case, the building is probably not locked otherwise as well. So you can come anytime there. And since it's not a museum, it's open for visitors more or less all day long, and it's also sort of advantage. The second monument I would choose, well, probably the Golden Gate.
Oh.
The gigantic arch with three curved spans. It was crowned by a sculptural composition of Emperor Theodosius at the race of a chariot drawn by elephants.
Yes.
So, and it was closed for many years. This place, Yedikule, it's now called, Seven Towers in Turkish. So it was used. It was used as a museum of Yedikule, of the Ottoman monument, but the Golden Gate is part of it. But now it's open again. It's one of the good news about recent developments in Istanbul. So it was closed, but now it's opened, and so a tourist can ascend on top to the place where the chariot with elephants was, and from this high vantage, the visitor can see a grand panorama of the Sea of Marmara and the great Theodosian Wall extending to the north, And if I'm not mistaken, Lord Byron once said that this is the most magnificent view he ever saw in his life. So, and a visitor can walk through the side arches of the gate per se, and this arch was built for the ages. Its slabs fit so closely together that not even a blade of a razor could be fit between them. And this edifice is absolutely huge. It's made of completely of marble, more than 65 meters wide and almost 20 meters tall. Yeah. So it's undescribable might. That's what I can say. It's absolutely undescribable might. So, and the third monument would be the Church of Pamakaristos, today's Fethiye Jami Mosque. It's a little bit complicated because Pamakaristos, together with Hora, was officially reconverted to a mosque, to the status of a mosque. But whereas Hora was locked absolutely since this very moment, it's this proclamation. Nobody knows what's inside, what's going on inside. With Pamakaristos, this was another story, also very tricky. It's sometimes open and sometimes closed. So the main building is functioning mosque, but what we are interested in Byzantium-wise is a paraklesion, so a side chapel, which served as a museum. So now officially it's back, it's a mosque back, but still it somehow functions, or from time to time it functions as a museum. It's reveals the ambiguity of the recent cultural politics in Istanbul. And this Fethiye, this paraklesion of Pamakaristos is absolutely undescribably beautiful, both from outside and inside. The mosaics inside are probably the best mosaics of the 14th century in Constantinople, or probably in Byzantium at all. And to my taste, their quality is even higher than the quality of Hora mosaics, which are so famous. Fethiye is much less famous, but it definitely deserves a visit. So this would be three, main stars on my list.
Those are excellent choices, and they are all sort of densely associated with historical events and historical people that we know about from many texts, and you talk about some of them in the guidebook. And I've had a similar experience on top of the Golden Gate. It's a magnificent view up there.
Absolutely.
And yeah, fortunately, I took photos of my daughter he came onto the trip for a few days, and it was about 8 years ago now. And yeah, there's really magnificent sight. And the Pamakaristos Church is, I've studied it because of Tarhaniotis, who's one of these noblemen of the 14th century who was buried there. So anyway, these are very important monuments. Now, these are also, unmistakable features of the landscape. They are sort of discrete monuments that have received studies. But in your book, you explore the city, all of the nooks and crannies and, the doors and corners, and you go poking around. And there's some of these things are not obvious on the landscape, and they're not that well known. Some people might not even know where they are. So what are some of the strangest or least likely uses of Byzantine buildings that you've come across?
Yes, this is what I'm mostly proud of in my book, because yes, I'm sure I enumerated all such places in Istanbul, and there are many unorthodox uses for Byzantine monuments there. So the most common one is just storage. Yeah, for example, the famous, not so famous, but more or less known place, probably erroneously labeled the Palace of Votiniatis. The Palace of Votiniatis. So it's overground, very impressive construction. We probably can be sure that it's not a palace, but anyway, it's very impressive. mid-Byzantine structure. It's used as storage for refreshment drinks. The same can be said about many other places. For example, the crypt of one of the most famous churches in Constantinople, Halkopratia, of which nothing more, well, practically nothing is left, but its crypt is more or less intact. It's situated in the basement of a hotel nearby. I evade naming the hotel, not to be blamed of product placement, but anyway, so this basement is also, this crypt is also used as a storage. Very impressive overground cisterns of Pandokrator Monastery are simply in private property, and they stay forgotten and empty. So you can just knock on the door of the owner of the house nearby and ask for permission to enter, and probably he will let you in. It's very impressive because this Byzantine structure is exclusively for you. It's not for tourists, it's not for storage, it's for you, and it's also sort of very, very impressive. But the most well, there are obvious cases of military usage. For example, the Manganes Palace, and monastery, which is near Bosphorus, and well, it's more or less near the Sultan's Palace. The main museum of Istanbul, and still it's in military use, and tourists may not enter this area, which is. I've never been there, but of course it must be very impressive. But the most interesting place is probably the oldest Christian church in Europe. I dare say it's Martyrium of Carpus and Popilus, which for many decades served as a metalwork. It was very easy to enter, but it was very dark. You had to bring your own light with you. Now it was repurposed and became a nightclub. And so you can enter. Now it's properly lit. It's a very weird architecture, very interesting, extremely interesting. But the most impressive is that the Byzantine fresco is exactly over the head of the bartender. So there is a bartender and a Byzantine inscription with a quote from Old Testament. So there are many very weird places in Istanbul.
Yes, from your guidebook, I was trying to imagine you trying to get access to these places or creeping into them, or anyway, visiting nightclubs, but for very different purposes than one usually does. So I'm sure you felt this too. I feel it often in historical places, where sometimes I will have an overwhelming feeling of sort of the presence of history in a specific place, and I get goosebumps just imagining like all of the people, whose lives I know and have studied were right there. And like, I imagine our historical paths kind of intersecting. Anyway, I just get a really strong sense of that sometimes. So in what place do you most feel this kind of sense of history being present, alongside you?
Well, in this respect, I think Hagia Sophia is incomparable. Well, of course, well over all other places, because every inch of its walls was adorned with icons, each of its own history, and every slab of its pavement endowed with a special ceremonial role, precisely described by Constantine Porphyrogenitus and in his schizophrenically, book on ceremonies. Indeed, I dedicated 45 pages of my guidebook exclusively to Hagia Sophia. It deserves it because, two small examples. On the eastern wall of the South Gallery, we encounter a fairly dilapidated door which is now marked with number 51 for some reasons. I don't know who counted them. So it does not lead anywhere now, but once it served as the entrance to the gallery that allowed the imperial court to come directly from the palace to the church without passing through the city. So many very meaningful and important events took place at this very threshold. For example, in 1183, during the coronation of Isaac Angelus, the dethroned emperor Andronicus Comnenus used this entrance when he decided to strike Isaac in the heart with his bow. But that at this very moment, the string snapped, dealing him a stunning blow, according to the legend. So we can visualize exactly where Andronicus stood, aiming at Isaac. Or in the southeast column of the gallery, it was the home of Hagia Sophia's guardian angel. And we also know for sure that he was living inside this exact pillar, because there is a very famous legend that one day during the construction of the church, all the workers went to have lunch, leaving behind only a small boy, and this boy was visited by a radiant creature. He initially thought to be one of the court eunuchs, and he asked the boy why work had stopped, and then told him to go find the crew and urge them to work without interruption. And the boy said that he had been told to keep watch over everyone's tools and needed to stay, but the visitor promised to keep watch himself until the boy returns. And when the boy carried his message to the absent workers, Justinian was with them, and the emperor quickly tallied up that this eunuch was in fact an angel, and so he immediately sent the boy permanently to Rome so that the angel would guard the new church forever. And every resident of Constantinople knew exactly where the angel was hiding. The medieval tale, which you just mentioned, leaves no room for doubt that he was to the right side of the pillar from which the arch rises to the dome. So according to Christian Nestor, Christian serving in the Ottoman army, one night before the final assault on Constantinople in 1433, the angel left his post after 800 years and ascended as a flaming pillar into the sky. So this edifice is imbued with such stories, literally every inch of it. So in this respect, there is no other, I would say there is no other building in Europe like this. Two or three probably we can think of, but otherwise it's absolutely filled with history.
You're right. I mean, any corner or pillar of that building that we want to talk about, we can find some story that's connected to it.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And that's what I love about your guidebook too, is that it's not just an architectural description of the monuments, but you talk about how they were designed to be used and how they eventually came to be used, which is often very different from the way they were designed. And so there's this kind of interplay between the monuments and the history. And I wanted to ask you about that because there's a lot of Byzantine monuments that we study apart from the events and people that interacted with them, and reverse that historians often talk about events taking place without sort of thinking about the kind of architectural background that they're taking place in. So is there an event or kind of event in Byzantine life that you think we would understand much better if we thought about it more closely in relation to its built environment rather than just kind of abstractly as a narrative?
Well, there are many such instances. One example would be the so-called prison of Animas. Well, it's not prison in fact, and it's not of Animas. It's part of the palace of Lacherna, and probably prison occupied this tiniest fraction of this huge building. But the story told by Psalos always seemed enigmatic to me until I saw the actual place. So when Psellos talks about the rebellion of Leo Tornikios in 1047, he describes how he approached the walls of the city and wanted to overthrow Constantine Monomachos. And Psellos says that the emperor decided to show himself to the rebel, and so ordered his throne to be put on the protruding side of the palace. And I wondered how the rebel could see him if he was standing in front of the city wall. How could he see the emperor sitting in his palace? And when I approached the actual spot, I realized right away that this is the place where the palace of Vlacherna merges with the wall, physically merges. So the wall of the palace becomes the city wall, and it's very you can very vividly visualize how he was sitting and the rebel was addressing him from below, and as the Psellos describes to us, other rebels, a group given to public clowning and vulgarity, dismounted from the horses in the view of the emperor, made a circle and began to dance and to perform comic scenes about the emperor and stomping their feet to the beat of their song and hopping about. And all this is very easily visualizing when you're standing in front of this place of the Vlacherna wall. But there are many other places as well like this.
Yes, this is like Byzantine Civil War, the musical.
Yeah. Yes.
Yes. It's so fascinating that you mentioned that episode, because that's a scene in Psellos that I have read many, many times. And I realize now that I have a very vague and generic image of where the emperor was sitting and how this was taking place. And now that I know this, I will go, and next time I'm there, I will seek out this place, because I want to have a very specific and accurate picture of where this was taking place. Didn't they also shoot at the emperor with like a catapult or something?
Yes, absolutely. Yes. Yeah.
I have to see that.
And the arrow wounded one of the servants nearby.
So your book is organized, apart from specific monuments like Hagia Sophia, which gets a chapter. Otherwise, they're like routes. So you group the monuments according to like proximity or along a particular route. Now, some of these routes are what we would say like off the beaten path. They're not the most well known. So which is the one that you would send, which is like the most underrated you found that had received the less attention? Like what part of the city is like more forgotten?
Well, it would be probably northwest in many senses. First of all, it's not easy to reach from the tip of historical peninsula, because the transportations are not so easy. Probably they are going to open a tram line along the Golden Horn, then it will be much easier.
Oh, right.
But now you have to probably sail in a boat up the Golden Horn. So Vlacherna, northwest of the city, is littered with Byzantine monuments, especially because this was the place which became the center of the city in its latest phase of history, because the imperial palace moved, the emperors moved from the big palace, from the great palace, to Vlacherna palace, and of course the business life also moved to northwest. So there are around 30 Byzantine spots or monuments or ruins in Vlacherna, and many of them are not very well known. For example, extremely beautiful church of St. John in Trullo, is very, very poorly known and not studied properly by scholars, or the so-called Bogdan Sarai, which is now a storage for old car tires. But it used to be probably a funerary chapel of a church, and many other places. So Northwestern is very promising area, and I believe someday the great palace of Vlacherna will be properly excavated, because it's sticking from the ground here and there in many places, as if this palace is trying to crawl out from under the earth. And I'm sure it's very easy, and it will be done someday. So yes, Vlacherna probably the most underrated part of the Byzantine city.
Yeah, I hope it's excavated. The first time I went there was, I think, in '94, and I didn't have, obviously, a proper guide or anything like that. And when I got to that part of the city, I was just lost. I was just a jumble of architectural things. Like, I have no idea what's going on here. So yes, that definitely needs some clearing up, and yeah, much more attention. So now that you've established again that you're a poet, let's talk about some actual.
I'm not fishing for compliment.
Oh, well, okay. No, sorry, I was just reading Horenner's book on Byzantine poetry earlier today. Okay, so let's talk about some actual poems. So many of the monuments and artifacts that you describe had or still have accompanying poems, which Byzantines call epigrams, and you helpfully translate these for the readers. So if they go to the place and there was an accompanying epigram, they can read it in your book. So is there one of these that's a favorite of yours? Maybe because either for its poetic qualities or because what it adds to the monument just by being there as a text that accompanies it?
Mm-hmm. Well, yes, many of them are very meaningful, and I'm trying my best to explain why they're so meaningful to the reader. For example, the verse inscription from Sergeys and Varkas mentions Justinian as a sleepless emperor. So probably he was boastful of his ability not to sleep much, and but we know from Procopius that this was exactly Procopius was blaming Justinian for his sleeplessness. It adds vividness to the intellectual life of this period. But the most beloved one by me is the inscription from a frieze which is now in the archaeological museum, which says, "For you alone have built. For you alone, I think, have built innumerable temples throughout the whole earth." So these are the lines from the epigram to the Church of St. Polyeuctus, erected by Anicia Juliana in the beginning of the 6th century. And you know the story. In 1965, they were digging a pit in Saraçhane district of Istanbul, and they found this small piece of frieze with this inscription, very artfully made. And Mango and Shevchenko right away understood that this was the famous epigram, the part of the famous epigram. So why is it so important? Because the woman who sponsored the building of Polyeuctus, this Anicia Juliana, was a very famous person. She traced her family to the Emperor Theodosius I, and she had 3 emperors among her ancestors. And St. Gregory of Tours relates that when Justinian came to power, he cast an envious eye upon Anicia's immense wealth and hinted to her that it would be a nice idea to donate it to the state treasury. But in response, she asked for some time to consolidate it, and receiving grace period, immediately spent all her entire fortune on the building of St. Polyeuctus. And when Justinian approached her again, Anisha proposed to pray together in the newly built church. And the emperor realized that he had been tricked. And of course, this is a legend because the church was built for many years and Justinian certainly knew about it. But still, it's very telling that this form of the story made it all the way to the distant France, to Tours. Apparently, Anisha's church did occasion jealousy on the part of Justinian, and this epigram is in fact an insult to him. So we can somehow reconstruct his feelings, and his answer to the pesky old woman was Hagia Sophia. So Hagia Sophia was a sort of response not to King Solomon, as it's told in the legend of building of this church, but in fact to the pesky old Anisha Juliana. I like this piece of inscription very much.
Yes, isn't it amazing that we have the text of the inscription in manuscripts because it was preserved by collectors of epigrams later on, and all of the stories about these churches and the relations among, these aristocrats and emperors and so on. And then we find the actual inscribed inscription in situ. I mean, I just think that this is just a remarkable fortune.
Yes. I'm always thrilled when these things happen. Yes, this coincidence. Yeah, this proves that history indeed existed.
Because sometimes we do doubt it. Yes. So which monument is currently closed to the public, but that of all the monuments that are closed, this is the one that you would choose to open if you could?
In my guidebook, I underlined the names of closed monuments, saying that you have to take some measures. In some cases, it's easy. For example, you have to address the imam of a certain mosque. It normally works. In other cases, you have to procure the permission of a certain organization. It also happens from time to time. For example, the huge cistern of under the Pantocrator monastery. It's theoretically can be entered, but it takes some effort. But in some cases, it's impossible when a monument is a sort of military zone, and this applies 100% to the only church which is absolutely intact and which I never saw. This is the church of Panagia Kamariotissa on Heybeliada island, among the Princess Islands, so nearby Istanbul. So it's very interesting from the architectural point of view. It's a tetraconch church, Komnenian period, and it's interested in the sense it uses squinches instead of pendentives. So it's very interestingly built. But I never saw it because, unfortunately, it is situated on the grounds of a naval academy, and outside visitors are never admitted it. And for the last time, it was seen by a specialist like 70 years ago.
Right. My choice would probably be the Pantocrator monastery as a whole, just as the floor and the Komnenian tombs and all of these things that I think have never been properly studied.
And the last developments were very unfortunate with Pantocrator. Unfortunately, because it was refurbished recently, but it was refurbished in the Ottoman, not Byzantine sense.
Yeah.
For example, the carpets were nailed to the pavement, whereas beforehand you could somehow open the actual Komnenian pavement with mosaics. Officially not anymore. And there are other instances like this. Yes, it's very sad.
So along the same lines, but it's slightly different. Which monument has been completely lost that you would bring back? If you could pick one from the mists of history that is just lost to us forever, which one would you like to have back?
What first comes to mind is, of course, Holy Apostles. the second biggest
right, yes.
church of Constantinople. But on the other hand, you cannot but admit that we have many depictions. At least we have some depictions of it, even of its interior. There are illuminations in different manuscripts which depicts the interior of the Holy Apostles, and we have very detailed descriptions of Messarites. So we can go to Venice and look at San Marco, which is also a sort of copy of Holy Apostles. So therefore, my choice, if it will be one monument, it would be Theotokos Perivleptos, the monastery, the church erected in the 11th century, which was completely demolished. There are 3 pieces of ruins which I describe how to reach from 3 different directions, but they make no impression at all. It's completely sentimental to know that these bricks belong to Perivleptos. Perivleptos is now the Armenian church Surp Kevork, but the new one. And it's heavily guarded because there is an Armenian school, and for obvious reasons, there are very severe measures of guarding this place. You can never enter the substructures and so on. But from what we know from all the descriptions, beginning with ironic description by Psalos, and
yes.
to the Rus pilgrims and to the Crusaders, by the way, who were looting it. It's obvious that it was the place of note and undescribably beautiful church. If I were a magician, I would bring to life this building.
So there is hope that more sites will be discovered in the future. I don't think anyone was expecting, for example, that the harbor excavations, that there would be harbor excavations at all. It just became, they came about through a different project. Is there hope for any particular monument that you think might still be excavated or found somewhere, or just some new discovery that will add to our knowledge in a significant way? Do you think there's hope for that?
Well, they open some monuments every day while on construction works, just digging pits for new buildings. They invariably find something. The other story is that they normally cover it up immediately, of course, not to be pressured to prolong the time of exploration by the archaeologists. But nevertheless, so there are places where the archaeologists are allowed to dig, to excavate for some time. For example, take Haydar Pasha train station, which is now being excavated very properly, and it's on the Asian side of the Bosphorus. So it's Halkidon, not Constantinople properly speaking, but anyway. So they found. Unfortunately, they do not disclose what they found up to this day, but occasional photos taken by different people say that it's extremely interesting and promising site. It's on the eastern side. On the western side, a whole new district on the western extremities of today's Istanbul. They call it more or less conventionally Bathonea, but I doubt that Bathonea was a genuine name of the neighborhood. Anyway, it's on the northeastern shore of the lake Küçükçekmece. And archaeologists found a huge neighborhood with the shipyards, docks, the hospital, with pharmacy, and even with some drugs in amphora. intact, and churches and living quarters. And there are some chances that, in fact, this was the neighborhood named St. Mamas. This was St. Mamas, right, where the Rus merchants coming from to Tsargrad, from Rus, were being stationed, not as it was normally assumed, not St. Mamas on the Bosphorus, because on the Bosphorus it's unthinkable that a whole fleet would be standing on anchor for well, half a year. The Bosphorus is not like this. It will not allow anything to stand on anchor for a long time. So probably this was Küçükçekmece, this lake, which was in fact the harbor where the Rus merchants lived. And I just a couple of weeks ago, I was shown around by archaeologists excavating there, and these remains are really remarkable, unbelievably remarkable. So I'm sure many other places will be excavated in the near future, for the obvious reason that the mayor of Istanbul, Ekrem İmamoğlu, is making an emphasis that Byzantine history is our history, our city's history, and we should not somehow proclaim it a bête noire of the history of Istanbul. And due to the help from the mayor's office, Turkish archaeologists began re-excavating, for example, Bukuleon, which was for the last time excavated by the French occupying forces 100 years ago. Now they are returned to this place, and they already found many very interesting things, beginning with the period when this palace was built, and ending with the grim history of its afterlife, because just recently they found many skeletons there, and I assume these are the skeletons of the political prisoners put there by John Apokafkas in the 14th century. So it's a highly interesting. So, or take the other place, the Church of Euphemia near the Hippodrome. Everybody knew that there are frescoes, well, late Byzantine frescoes, but it was the part of the Ministry of the Interior. That's why they were inaccessible. But now they are preparing, and they will soon open it as a museum. They just moved the fence, several meters, and
yes,
open it for the public. So many other places, of course, can be still opened. Or we can probably hope that some of them will not be demolished any further, like Studios, which is now completely falling apart. The Church of Studios, which is sadly put into the realm of the religious ministry from the Ministry of Culture. So it's once again, it's a sad ruin. You will nobody will ever pray there. So it's a purely symbolic step, of course. But it's of course it's extremely deplorable, I would say so.
Yeah, I mean, Istanbul is a place where anywhere you dig, you will probably soon be excavating. Or where anything can in theory be turned into a museum. I mean, the whole place is like that, and it is a very heavy burden to maintain all of these monuments. I mean, it's and expensive. So let's hope that preserving Byzantine Constantinople is not only taken on as a part of the history of modern Turkey, but also as a profitable thing to do. And with your book, it will be all the more accessible. So, thank you for writing it, and thank you for coming onto the podcast as well. So we're almost out of time. Do you have any final thoughts you want to share from your search for Constantinople?
Well, I would advise people to come to Istanbul with my books and with my book in hand, as soon as possible, because the city is going away. Well, my general impression from my 25 years of coming to Istanbul, that Constantinople is going away slowly but surely. There are many things which are no more. For example, the Golden Gate, there used to be a wonderful relief with an eagle
Yes.
in the wall, and
Yes.
it just disappeared, and
Oh, no.
nobody knows where it is. And there are many such things. So and other monuments are disfigured, I would say, like Tekfur Saray, which it's a 14th century palace, and now on its wall they hung an elevator, which completely ruined all the impression from the monument. So such things also happen all the time. And so in this respect, I say that gradually the city of old is leaving us. And so come as soon as you can.
Yes, that reminds me of the opening of Herodotus, the oblivion caused by time, and so we have to preserve it every so often.
Yeah.
Thank you, Sergey. This was wonderful. It was a pleasure to speak with you again, and thank you for writing this book.
Thank you. Bye.